Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we're embarking on a journey that will challenge everything you thought you knew about human history. We're diving deep into one of the most controversial and captivating theories of our time, the work of a man who has spent decades searching for traces of a civilization that vanished from the Earth over 12,000 years ago. As always, let me know where in the world you're listening from. Get cozy, settle in, and let's begin. Imagine for a moment that everything we've been taught about the dawn of civilization is incomplete, that the story of humanity didn't begin with the Sumerians or the Egyptians, but thousands of years earlier, with a highly advanced society that was wiped from existence in a cosmic catastrophe so devastating that it nearly erased all memory of what came before. This isn't science fiction. This is the life's work of Graham Hancock, a British journalist turned alternative historian whose theories about Atlantis and lost civilizations have captivated millions while infuriating the archaeological establishment. Graham Hancock didn't start out as a controversial figure. Born in Edinburgh, Scotland in 1950, he spent his early career as a respected journalist, writing for The Times, The Sunday Times, and serving as East Africa correspondent for The Economist. His first major books examined international development and corruption in the aid industry. But in the early 1990s, something changed. Hancock became fascinated by ancient mysteries, by the impossible precision of monuments built by cultures we're told had only stone tools, by flood myths that appeared in virtually every ancient civilization, by maps that seemed to show coastlines as they appeared thousands of years before they should have been charted. What he discovered would consume the next 3 decades of his life and fundamentally challenge our understanding of who we are and where we came from. At the heart of Hancock's work lies a single, explosive claim, that before the rise of Mesopotamia, before the pyramids of Egypt, before any civilization known to mainstream archaeology, there existed an advanced maritime culture, with sophisticated knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, and engineering. This civilization, which Hancock carefully avoids calling Atlantis, though the connection is clear, flourished during the last ice age and was destroyed around 12,800 years ago by what Hancock proposes were comet impacts that triggered the Younger Dryas, a period of dramatic climate change that plunged the world back into near glacial conditions. The few survivors of this cataclysm, Hancock argues, traveled to various parts of the world, settling among hunter-gatherer communities and teaching them the secrets of agriculture, architecture, and astronomical observation. In Hancock's interpretation, these mysterious teachers were remembered in myths and legends as gods and civilizing figures: Quetzalcoatl in Mesoamerica, Viracocha in South America, Osiris and Thoth in Egypt. Some of these myths describe the civilizers with specific physical characteristics, though the reliability of such details after thousands of years of oral transmission remains debatable. These weren't just myths, Hancock suggests. They were memories of real people from a real civilization, distorted by time but preserving fragments of an astonishing truth. The story of Plato's Atlantis is one that has haunted human imagination for over 2,000 years. Around 350 years before the Common Era, the Greek philosopher described a powerful island nation that existed 9,000 years before his time. According to Plato, Atlantis was a sophisticated civilization with impressive architecture, advanced technology for its era, and a powerful navy. But this great civilization, he wrote, sank into the ocean in a single day and night of catastrophic destruction, punished by the gods for its hubris and corruption. For centuries, scholars have debated whether Plato intended his story as allegory, as a philosophical thought experiment about the dangers of imperialism and moral decay, or whether he was recording genuine ancient history passed down through Egyptian priests to the Greek lawgiver Solon. Most academics have long dismissed Atlantis as pure fiction, a cautionary tale wrapped in the trappings of a lost world, but Hancock sees something different in Plato's account. He sees the garbled memory of a real catastrophe, the fragments of genuine history preserved in mythological form. The details may have been distorted over millennia of retelling. The timeline may have been confused. The location may have been misremembered, but the core truth remains. There was an advanced civilization. It was destroyed by cataclysm, and its survivors influenced the development of later cultures across the globe. This isn't wishful thinking or romantic fantasy, Hancock argues. The evidence is there, carved in stone, recorded in myth, and increasingly supported by cutting-edge science. From the inexplicable precision of ancient monuments to the sudden appearance of agriculture in multiple locations around the world, from the astronomical alignments built into structures erected by supposedly primitive peoples to the geological evidence of a massive cosmic impact at the end of the Ice Age, the fingerprints of this lost civilization are everywhere once you learn to see them. The question isn't whether this civilization existed, Hancock would tell you, but why mainstream archaeology refuses to acknowledge what's right in front of their eyes. Hancock's theories have made him both wildly popular and deeply controversial. His books have sold millions of copies and been translated into dozens of languages. His Netflix series Ancient Apocalypse was watched by tens of millions of people in its first weeks of release, becoming one of the streaming platform's most successful documentaries. He's a regular guest on Joe Rogan's podcast, where his appearances routinely draw millions of listeners. Yet the archaeological establishment treats him with contempt, labeling his work pseudoscience and pseudo-archaeology, accusing him of cherry-picking evidence and promoting dangerous ideas rooted in colonialist thinking. The debate has become so heated that it's moved beyond academic disagreement into the realm of culture war, with both sides dug into their positions and unwilling to give ground. But tonight, we're not here to take sides. We're here to understand, to examine Hancock's theories about Atlantis and this lost Ice Age civilization in detail, to explore the evidence he presents and the arguments he makes, to understand why millions find his work compelling and why thousands of professional archaeologists reject it. Because whatever you think of Graham Hancock's conclusions, his questions are worth asking. Why do flood myths appear in virtually every ancient culture? How did supposedly primitive peoples achieve such remarkable feats of engineering and astronomical observation? What really happened at the end of the Ice Age to trigger such dramatic climate change? And if there's even a possibility that an advanced civilization was destroyed 12,000 years ago, what does that mean for our understanding of human history and our own vulnerability to catastrophe? So settle in, turn off the lights, and prepare to journey back through the mists of time to an age when the world was very different, when ice sheets covered much of the northern hemisphere, when sea levels were hundreds of feet lower than today, and when, if Graham Hancock is right, a sophisticated civilization was about to meet its doom in fire and flood. This is the story of humanity's forgotten chapter, the story of Atlantis, as Graham Hancock believes it truly was. The year was 1995, and Graham Hancock was about to publish a book that would change his life and challenge conventional archaeology in ways no one could have predicted. Fingerprints of the Gods. The evidence of Earth's lost civilization hit bookstores like a thunderbolt, presenting a sweeping narrative that connected dozens of ancient mysteries into a single provocative theory. The book would go on to sell millions of copies, inspire countless readers to question accepted history, and establish Hancock as one of the most influential and controversial figures in alternative archaeology. The journey that led to Fingerprints of the Gods began with simple curiosity about ancient maps. In particular, Hancock became fascinated by the Piri Reis map, a genuine historical document created by an Ottoman admiral in 1513 that showed remarkable detail of the coastlines of South America and, most intriguingly, what appeared to be the coast of Antarctica. But here's where things get interesting. The map seemed to show Antarctica not as the ice-covered continent we know today, but with its coastline clearly delineated as it would have appeared before massive ice sheets covered it. How could a 16th century mapmaker have access to information about Antarctica's ice-free coastline, information that modern humans only discovered in the 20th century using sophisticated sub-ice surveying technology? The answer, according to Professor Charles Hapgood, whose work heavily influenced Hancock, was that the Piri Reis map might have been copied from much older source maps, potentially created thousands of years ago by an unknown civilization with advanced knowledge of geography and navigation. In 1960, a United States Air Force commander named Lieutenant Colonel Harold Ohlmeyer examined the map at Hapgood's request and stated in a letter that certain features appeared to represent the subglacial topography of Queen Maud Land in Antarctica, details that had been hidden under ice for thousands of years. This interpretation remains controversial among cartographers and historians, but it represented a genuine mystery that demanded explanation in Hancock's view. Hancock took this mystery and ran with it, weaving together threads from seemingly unrelated fields: ancient cartography, myths of flood and destruction, astronomical alignments in ancient monuments, the sudden appearance of agriculture in multiple locations around the world, legends of civilizing gods and culture heroes, geological evidence of dramatic climate change at the end of the Ice Age. Each element on its own might be curiosity or coincidence, but together, Hancock argued, they pointed to something extraordinary. The centerpiece of Fingerprints of the Gods was a theory borrowed from Canadian researchers Rand and Rose Flemath, though Hancock is often mistakenly credited as its originator. The theory proposed that Antarctica, before it was covered by ice, had been the location of an advanced civilization. This wasn't the Antarctica we know, frozen and inhospitable. According to the hypothesis, a phenomenon called Earth crustal displacement had caused the entire outer crust of the planet to shift, moving Antarctica from a more temperate latitude to its current position over the South Pole. This shift, the theory went, happened relatively recently in geological terms, around 10,450 years before the Common Era, and it explained both the sudden glaciation of Antarctica and the catastrophic climate changes that affected the entire planet at the end of the Ice Age. Earth crustal displacement was a genuine scientific theory, albeit a highly controversial one, proposed by Charles Hapgood and even endorsed for a time by Albert Einstein. The idea was that the Earth's crust could, under certain conditions, slip over the more fluid mantle beneath it, like the skin of an orange sliding over the fruit inside. This would cause continents to shift position relatively rapidly, bringing tropical lands into polar regions and vice versa. The trigger for such an event, Hapgood suggested, might be an uneven buildup of ice at the poles, creating an imbalance that eventually caused the crust to shift. Mainstream geologists have thoroughly rejected this theory. The evidence from plate tectonics, from the geological record, from our understanding of the Earth's structure, all contradicts the possibility of such rapid crustal displacement. But Hancock saw in it an explanation for many ancient mysteries. If Antarctica had indeed been in a more temperate zone before a crustal displacement event, a civilization could have developed there. And if that civilization had been advanced enough to chart coastlines and navigate across oceans, they would have spread across the globe, trading, exploring, and perhaps even establishing colonies or settlements in distant lands. When catastrophe struck, when the crust shifted and Antarctica began its journey toward the pole, this civilization would have been devastated. Imagine the chaos, the very ground beneath their feet moving, violent earthquakes, massive volcanic eruptions, tsunamis beyond imagination, climate change happening not over centuries but over years or decades. The civilization that had flourished would have been shattered, its cities destroyed, its people scattered or killed. But some would have survived, and these survivors, Hancock argued, would have carried their knowledge to other parts of the world, seeking refuge among the hunter-gatherer peoples who had lived in regions less affected by the catastrophe. This is where the myths come in. Hancock spent considerable time in Fingerprints of the Gods examining the legends and creation stories of ancient cultures around the world. In Egypt, there were Osiris and Thoth, gods associated with wisdom, agriculture, and the establishment of civilization. In Mesoamerica, there was Quetzalcoatl, the plumed serpent, who in some later Spanish colonial accounts was described with certain physical characteristics, though earlier indigenous sources focused more on his divine and symbolic attributes. In South America, particularly among the Inca and their predecessors, there was Viracocha, another figure who traveled through the land bringing knowledge and order. In Sumer, the oldest known civilization in Mesopotamia, there were the Apkallu, 7 sages who, according to myth, emerged from the sea before the flood and taught humanity various arts. The parallels were striking to Hancock. Across vast distances, separated by oceans, ancient peoples told stories of wise beings who came and taught important skills, from farming to building to understanding celestial patterns. In Hancock's interpretation, these weren't gods in the supernatural sense, but survivors of the lost civilization. Refugees who had managed to preserve fragments of their advanced knowledge and were now sharing it with the peoples they encountered. Over time, as generations passed and memories faded, these teachers were elevated to divine status, their real origins forgotten, their humanity transformed into mythology. This interpretation, however, requires accepting that the mythological accounts preserve genuine historical memory, despite thousands of years of cultural transformation, and that similar themes couldn't arise independently or through cultural diffusion. Critics would later point out that many of these descriptions emphasized that these civilizers were bearded or pale-skinned, and they accused Hancock of promoting the racist idea that indigenous peoples couldn't have developed their own civilizations without help from white benefactors. Hancock vehemently denied this charge, arguing that he was simply reporting what the myths actually said, and that the civilization he proposed would likely have included people of various ethnicities, given its global reach. But the criticism stuck, and it remains one of the most contentious aspects of his work. Hancock also explored the astronomical knowledge embedded in ancient monuments. The Great Pyramid of Giza, he noted, is aligned with extraordinary precision to true north, with an error of only 3/60ths of a degree. Its internal passageways and chambers incorporate complex mathematical relationships that some researchers interpret as encoding sophisticated astronomical knowledge. The three pyramids of Giza, according to Robert Bauval's Orion correlation theory, which Hancock championed, appear to be positioned to mirror the three stars of Orion's belt. Bauval and Hancock argued these pyramids were aligned not to how Orion appeared when the pyramids were conventionally dated around 2500 BCE, but to how the constellation appeared around 10,450 BCE. This interpretation has been heavily criticized by astronomers and Egyptologists who point out significant inaccuracies in the proposed alignment and note that the pyramids contain inscriptions clearly dating them to the 4th dynasty. Nevertheless, for Hancock, this suggested a connection to the date he proposed for major catastrophic events. Similar astronomical sophistication appeared in monuments around the world. The ancient city of Tiwanaku in Bolivia, high in the Andes, contained structures aligned with precision to celestial events. The megalithic site of Nabta Playa in Egypt featured a stone circle that functioned as an astronomical calendar, predating Stonehenge by 1,000 years. The Mayan calendar, with its incredible accuracy and its mysterious long count that tracked time over thousands of years, suggested knowledge far beyond what supposedly primitive people should have possessed. All of this, Hancock argued, pointed to a common source, a mother civilization that had developed advanced understanding of astronomy, mathematics, and engineering during the Ice Age, and whose survivors had transmitted this knowledge to peoples around the world. The fingerprints of this lost civilization were everywhere, if you knew where to look, in the impossible precision of ancient stonework, in the astronomical alignments built into monuments on different continents, in the flood myths that appeared in cultures worldwide, in the legends of wise teachers who came from elsewhere, in maps that showed coastlines as they appeared thousands of years before they were supposedly first charted. The book was a sensation. It combined the allure of ancient mystery with the structure of a detective story, following Hancock on his journeys to ancient sites around the world, examining evidence, connecting dots, building a case. Hancock's writing style, honed by years as a journalist, was accessible and engaging. He didn't write like an academic, with dry prose and careful hedging. He wrote with passion and conviction, inviting readers to join him on a quest for truth, and millions accepted the invitation. But the archaeological establishment was not impressed. Critics pointed out that Hancock had no formal training in archaeology or related fields. They noted that he selectively presented evidence that supported his theory while ignoring or downplaying evidence that contradicted it. They argued that his interpretations of myths and monuments were speculative at best, and often ignored the extensive research and understanding that professional archaeologists had developed over decades of careful study. The idea of Earth crustal displacement was rejected by geologists. The astronomical alignments he emphasized were often less precise than claimed or could be explained by chance. The sudden appearance of agriculture in multiple locations could be explained by independent invention without needing to invoke a lost civilization. And as for the ancient maps, critics suggested that the apparent accuracy was either coincidental or the result of later additions to older maps. Most damningly, critics asked a simple question: where is the physical evidence? If an advanced civilization had flourished for thousands of years during the Ice Age, where were their cities, their tools, their garbage dumps, their graves? Civilizations leave traces. The archaeological record from known civilizations is rich with artifacts, from the humblest pottery shards to the grandest monuments. Yet for Hancock's proposed Ice Age civilization, there was nothing but ambiguous structures, contestable interpretations, and myths. Hancock's response was that most of the evidence had been destroyed by the catastrophe that ended the civilization, and that what remained was likely buried under hundreds of feet of ocean water, since sea levels rose dramatically at the end of the Ice Age, flooding the coastal areas where such a maritime civilization would likely have been concentrated. This argument about submerged evidence would lead to Hancock's next major project, a documentary series called Underworld, Flooded Kingdoms of the Ice Age, which explored underwater structures off the coasts of India, Japan, and the Mediterranean. But before we get there, we need to understand the scientific revolution that would give Hancock's theories new life and transform his hypothesis from interesting speculation into something that, at least to him and his supporters, seemed increasingly plausible. That revolution centered on one of the most significant geological periods in recent Earth history, and on a controversial scientific hypothesis that suggested a cosmic catastrophe had struck our planet at the end of the Ice Age. It was called the Younger Dryas, and it would become the cornerstone of everything Graham Hancock would argue in the decades to come. To understand Graham Hancock's mature theory about Atlantis and the lost Ice Age civilization, we need to journey back to a time of dramatic planetary change. About 15,000 years ago, the Earth was emerging from the last Ice Age. For over 90,000 years, massive ice sheets had covered much of North America, Europe, and Asia. Some of these ice sheets were over 2 miles thick, containing unimaginable amounts of frozen water. But now, as the planet warmed, the ice was melting, slowly at first, then with increasing speed. The glaciers retreated northward, and the world transformed. This warming trend brought profound changes. Plants spread across lands that had been frozen wasteland. Animals moved northward, following the retreat of the ice. Early humans, who had survived the Ice Age by hunting megafauna like mammoths and mastodon, found their world expanding, growing warmer and more hospitable. It was a time of opportunity, of transformation, of slow but steady improvement in conditions. For about 4,000 years, this warming continued uninterrupted, and then, suddenly, catastrophically, it stopped. Around 12,800 years ago, the warming trend that had been steadily melting the ice sheets came to an abrupt halt. In a geological instant, which means over the span of just decades or centuries rather than millennia, temperatures plummeted. The planet was thrown back into near-glacial conditions. This cold snap lasted for approximately 1,200 years, a period geologists call the Younger Dryas, named after a flower called Dryas octopetala that thrives in cold conditions and whose pollen appears in sediment layers from this period. The return to cold wasn't the only dramatic change during the Younger Dryas. This was also the time when many of the great megafauna of the Ice Age went extinct. In North America alone, 37 genera of large mammals disappeared from the fossil record. Mammoths, mastodons, saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths, American camels and horses, dire wolves. These magnificent creatures that had dominated the landscape for tens of thousands of years vanished within a few centuries. Similar extinctions occurred in South America, where 52 genera disappeared, and to a lesser extent in other parts of the world. For decades, scientists debated what caused this sudden climate reversal and these mass extinctions. The dominant theory focused on what's called the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, a system of ocean currents that transports warm water from the tropics to the North Atlantic. The idea was that as the Ice Age glaciers melted, huge amounts of fresh water flowed into the North Atlantic, particularly from a massive glacial lake called Lake Agassiz. This influx of fresh water, being less dense than salt water, formed a layer on top of the ocean that disrupted the circulation system, effectively shutting down the conveyor belt that brought warm water north. Without that warm water, temperatures in the northern hemisphere plummeted, and the Younger Dryas began. This theory was widely accepted and fit well with the gradualist understanding of climate change that dominated geological thinking. Climate changed slowly, driven by predictable factors like ocean currents, atmospheric composition, and orbital variations. It was a comfortable theory, one that fit established patterns of thinking about the Earth's history. But then, in 2007, a group of scientists published a paper that proposed something radically different. They suggested that the Younger Dryas might have been triggered not by a gradual shutdown of ocean currents, but by a cosmic impact. A comet or asteroid, they argued, had struck the Earth around 12,800 years ago, causing the abrupt climate change, the mass extinctions, and other dramatic effects visible in the geological record. This was the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis, and it would become central to Graham Hancock's updated theory about the lost civilization. The hypothesis proposed that a large comet or asteroid had broken apart and struck the Earth in multiple locations, primarily hitting the massive ice sheets covering North America. The impacts, or airbursts, explosions occurring in the atmosphere before the fragments reached the ground, would have had catastrophic effects according to proponents. They would have instantly vaporized billions of tons of ice, creating unimaginable floods. They would have ignited massive wildfires across the continent, filling the atmosphere with smoke and soot. They would have ejected debris into the upper atmosphere, blocking sunlight and causing rapid global cooling. And they would have produced a range of unusual materials and markers that could potentially be identified in sediment layers dating to the onset of the Younger Dryas. The evidence cited for this impact by its proponents included several key elements. First, there was a widespread layer of black material, rich in carbon and soot, found at sites across North America, and even as far away as Europe and Asia. This layer contained evidence of massive fires and was dated to approximately the beginning of the Younger Dryas. Second, proponents argued this layer also contained unusual materials associated with cosmic impacts, including nanodiamonds, microscopic diamonds that can form under extreme temperatures and pressures, magnetic microspherules, tiny particles of melted and resolidified material, and elevated levels of platinum and iridium, elements that are rare on Earth's surface but more common in asteroids and comets. However, the reliability and reproducibility of these findings have been contested by other researchers, with some studies failing to find the same markers or questioning the interpretation of the data. Third, at sites across North America, there was evidence of sudden, catastrophic flooding on a scale almost beyond comprehension. The channeled scablands in Washington state, for instance, showed clear evidence of massive floods that had stripped away soil and carved deep channels in the bedrock. For decades, geologist J. Harlan Bretz had argued that these features could only be explained by catastrophic flooding, but he was ridiculed by his colleagues who insisted on gradualist explanations. Eventually, Bretz was vindicated when the evidence became overwhelming, but mainstream geology had been slow to accept his catastrophic interpretation. Now, the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis suggested that these floods hadn't been caused simply by glacial lake outbursts, but by the impact melting enormous volumes of ice essentially instantaneously. Fourth, the hypothesis offered an explanation for the mysterious disappearance of the Clovis culture, a distinct archaeological tradition in North America characterized by beautifully crafted stone projectile points. Clovis artifacts appeared in the archaeological record around 13,000 years ago and were widespread across North America. Then, at the Younger Dryas boundary, they abruptly disappeared. The Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis suggested that the people who made these tools had been devastated by the cosmic catastrophe. For Graham Hancock, the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis was a game changer. Here was mainstream science, or at least a faction of it, proposing exactly the kind of sudden, catastrophic event that could explain the destruction of his proposed Ice Age civilization. In his 2015 book Magicians of the Gods, Hancock embraced the impact hypothesis wholeheartedly and built it into the foundation of his updated theory. The comet impacts hadn't just caused climate change and extinctions, he argued. They had destroyed an advanced human civilization. Hancock painted a vivid picture of the catastrophe. Imagine, he suggested, a sophisticated maritime civilization spread across what are now submerged coastlines around the world. They had developed advanced knowledge of astronomy, having watched the skies for millennia. Perhaps they had even predicted the coming disaster, seeing the fragmented comet approaching Earth along the torrid meteor stream, a debris field our planet passes through twice a year. But prediction and prevention are different things. When the impacts came, they came with devastating force. Multiple fragments, some as large as pyramids, others as large as cities, slammed into the ice sheets covering North America or exploded in airbursts above the surface. The immediate effects would have been apocalyptic: massive earthquakes, volcanic eruptions triggered by the impacts, tsunamis racing across oceans at hundreds of miles per hour, unimaginable floods as billions of tons of ice instantly melted. wildfires igniting across entire continents, creating firestorms that consumed everything in their path. And above it all, debris and ash filling the atmosphere, turning day to night, blocking the sun for months or even years. The civilization that had thrived for thousands of years during the Ice Age would have been devastated. Their coastal cities and settlements, concentrated in areas that offered the best access to marine resources and trade routes, would have been struck first by the tsunamis and then swallowed by rising sea levels as the ice melted. Their knowledge, their achievements, their very existence would have been nearly erased in a matter of days or weeks, but some would have survived. Some would have been in the right place at the right time, away from the coasts, sheltered from the worst effects. And these survivors, Hancock argued, would have carried their knowledge to other parts of the world. This is where Hancock's theory becomes particularly compelling to his supporters. He argues that the sudden appearance of agriculture in multiple locations around the world, beginning around 10,000 years ago, wasn't a coincidence or independent invention. It was the result of survivors from the lost civilization teaching these techniques to hunter-gatherers. The astronomical knowledge encoded in ancient monuments wasn't developed from scratch by supposedly primitive peoples. It was handed down from those who had spent millennia watching the stars from a sophisticated civilization. The flood myths that appear in cultures worldwide weren't just metaphorical or based on local flooding events. They were genuine memories of the cosmic catastrophe, preserved and passed down through oral tradition for thousands of years. The timing, Hancock points out, fits remarkably well. Plato said Atlantis was destroyed 9,000 years before his time, which places the catastrophe around 11,600 years ago. This is close enough to the Younger Dryas boundary, at 12,800 years ago, to suggest that Plato's account, though garbled and imprecise, might preserve a genuine memory of a real event. The flood myths from around the world, from the Epic of Gilgamesh in Mesopotamia to the story of Noah in the Hebrew Bible, from Hindu texts describing the Great Deluge to Native American legends of world-destroying floods, all these might be pointing to the same catastrophe. But here's where things get controversial, and where the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis itself enters deeply contested territory. While the impact hypothesis has attracted some serious scientific support, it has also faced severe criticism from many geologists and archaeologists. Critics point out that no confirmed impact crater from this time period has been found. The evidence of cosmic materials in the sediment layers has proven difficult to reproduce consistently. Some studies that claimed to find nanodiamonds or other impact markers have failed to be replicated by other researchers. The timing of the various effects attributed to the impact doesn't always match up precisely, with dates varying by centuries or even millennia depending on the site and the dating method used. Most importantly, critics argue that the impact hypothesis isn't necessary to explain the Younger Dryas. The shutdown of ocean circulation from glacial meltwater provides a perfectly adequate explanation for the climate reversal. The megafaunal extinctions can be explained by a combination of climate change and hunting pressure from humans. The disappearance of the Clovis culture doesn't mean the people disappeared, just that they stopped making that particular style of tool and developed different technologies in response to changing conditions. The scientific debate over the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis has been fierce and, at times, deeply personal. Proponents accuse critics of defending the established paradigm at all costs, of refusing to examine new evidence with open minds, of attacking the hypothesis with flawed studies and biased interpretations. Critics accuse proponents of sloppy science, of making extraordinary claims without extraordinary evidence, of cherry-picking data that supports their view while ignoring contradictory findings. For Hancock, this scientific battle is reminiscent of historical cases where revolutionary ideas were initially rejected by the establishment before eventually being accepted. He often cites the examples of J. Harlan Bretz, whose catastrophic flooding interpretation of the channeled scablands was ridiculed for decades before being vindicated, or Alfred Wegener, whose theory of continental drift was dismissed before plate tectonics proved him essentially correct, or Luis and Walter Alvarez, whose asteroid impact theory for the dinosaur extinction was initially met with fierce skepticism before becoming widely accepted. But critics counter that, for every revolutionary idea that was initially rejected and later proven correct, there are thousands of fringe theories that were rejected and remained wrong. The fact that some radical ideas have been vindicated doesn't mean all radical ideas will be. And they argue that the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis, despite years of research and numerous published papers, has not produced the kind of definitive, reproducible evidence that would convince the broader scientific community. Where does this leave us? In a state of uncertainty and ongoing investigation. What is clear is that the Younger Dryas was a real and dramatic period of climate change. What is also clear is that something significant happened at the beginning of this period, something that affected the entire planet. Whether that something was a cosmic impact or a more conventional geological process remains a matter of intense debate. And whether any human civilization was advanced enough to be called sophisticated and was destroyed by these events, that remains the biggest question of all. For Hancock, the cosmic impact is now central to his theory. It provides the mechanism for the catastrophe that destroyed his proposed Ice Age civilization. It explains why so little physical evidence remains. The impacts and floods would have obliterated most traces. It accounts for the flood myths found in cultures worldwide, and it offers a warning for the present. If such a catastrophe happened 12,800 years ago, it could happen again. The fragments that struck Earth came from the torrid meteor stream, and Earth passes through this stream twice a year. Most years, nothing happens beyond some pretty meteor showers. But Hancock argues that there may be larger, darker objects lurking in this debris field, fragments we haven't yet detected, that could pose a threat in the future. This apocalyptic element gives Hancock's work an urgency that goes beyond mere historical curiosity. He's not just arguing about the past, he's warning about the future. If we ignore the evidence of what happened at the end of the Ice Age, if we dismiss it as impossible or inconvenient to establish theories, we may be leaving ourselves vulnerable to a repeat catastrophe. It's a powerful rhetorical move, transforming a debate about archaeology and geology into a matter of human survival. But let's set aside the controversy for a moment and focus on what Hancock believes this lost civilization actually looked like. What were they like? These people who supposedly flourished during the Ice Age and were destroyed by cosmic fire. What did they build? What did they know? And what traces did they leave behind? To answer these questions, we need to examine the archaeological sites that Hancock believes provide the clearest evidence for his theory. Sites that challenge our understanding of what supposedly primitive peoples were capable of achieving. If there's one archaeological site that has transformed the debate about ancient civilizations and given Graham Hancock's theories new credibility in the eyes of many, it's Göbekli Tepe. Located in southeastern Turkey, about 10 miles from the city of Şanlıurfa. This megalithic complex has been called the most important archaeological discovery of modern times. It's also become the centerpiece of Hancock's argument for a lost Ice Age civilization. And when you understand what archaeologists found there, you'll see why. Göbekli Tepe was discovered in 1963 during a survey of the region, but its significance wasn't recognized until German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt began excavations in 1995. What he found defied everything archaeologists thought they knew about the development of human civilization. The site consists of multiple circular and oval structures, built from massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some weighing 10 to 15 tons, elaborately carved with images of animals and abstract symbols. The pillars stand in circles, with 2 larger pillars at the center of each enclosure and smaller ones arranged around the perimeter. Here's what makes Göbekli Tepe so remarkable and so challenging to conventional archaeological thought. It was built around 11,600 years ago, at the very beginning of the Neolithic period. This makes it older than Stonehenge by over 6,000 years. It predates the Egyptian pyramids by 7,000 years. It predates the earliest Mesopotamian cities by thousands of years. And most shockingly, it was built by hunter-gatherers, people who had not yet developed agriculture, who did not make pottery, who did not work metal, who lived by hunting animals and gathering wild plants. According to the conventional narrative of human civilization, this shouldn't be possible. The story we've been told goes something like this. First, humans developed agriculture, which allowed them to produce surplus food. This surplus freed some people from the constant need to find food, allowing specialization of labor. With specialization came social hierarchies, cities, organized religion, monumental architecture, and all the other features we associate with civilization. Hunter-gatherers, in this narrative, lived in small bands, constantly moving to follow game and find edible plants. They didn't have the time, the labor force, or the social organization to build massive stone temples. But Göbekli Tepe turns this narrative on its head. Here were hunter-gatherers building structures that would have required enormous amounts of organized labor. The stone pillars had to be quarried from limestone bedrock, shaped and carved with stone tools, somehow transported to the site and erected. Each enclosure would have required hundreds or even thousands of person-hours of work, and this wasn't a one-time effort. The site contains at least 20 distinct enclosures, though only a fraction have been excavated. Göbekli Tepe wasn't a village. No one lived there permanently. It was a ceremonial center, a place where groups came together for rituals and gatherings. The sophistication of Göbekli Tepe goes beyond mere size. Recent studies have shown that the builders used sophisticated geometric principles in planning the structures. The positioning of the pillars wasn't random. Each enclosure was carefully designed with a central point, and the peripheral pillars were placed at calculated distances from this center. The builders clearly understood concepts of symmetry, proportion, and geometric relationships. This level of mathematical and architectural sophistication was, according to conventional thinking, supposed to come thousands of years later, after the development of agriculture and settled communities. The carvings on the pillars are equally intriguing. They depict a menagerie of animals: lions, foxes, boars, snakes, vultures, scorpions, and others, rendered with artistic skill that speaks to careful observation and practiced technique. Some of the animals are shown in aggressive poses, bearing teeth or claws. Abstract symbols appear alongside the animal carvings: H shapes, circles, crescents, arrangements that suggest meaning but resist easy interpretation. One pillar in particular, known as Pillar 43 in Enclosure D, has attracted enormous attention from alternative researchers including Hancock. This pillar features a complex arrangement of carved figures, and some researchers have argued that it represents an astronomical scene, potentially recording a specific configuration of stars or even depicting the comet fragments that Hancock believes struck Earth at the Younger Dryas boundary. Mainstream archaeologists are skeptical of this interpretation, arguing that we shouldn't impose our modern astronomical knowledge on ancient symbolic art without clear supporting evidence. But the fact remains that the builders of Göbekli Tepe clearly had sophisticated systems of belief and symbolism that we're only beginning to understand. For Graham Hancock, Göbekli Tepe is smoking gun evidence for his theory. He argues that hunter-gatherers, no matter how capable, couldn't have suddenly developed the knowledge and organizational skills needed to build something like this. There has to be, he insists, a long history of development behind it, a progression from simpler to more complex structures, from basic to sophisticated techniques. But that history is missing from the archaeological record. There are no sites showing the gradual development of megalithic building techniques leading up to Göbekli Tepe. It seems to appear fully formed, a complete package of architectural and artistic sophistication with no apparent precedent. This, Hancock argues, is exactly what you'd expect if Göbekli Tepe was built not by hunter-gatherers working entirely on their own, but by hunter-gatherers who had been taught by survivors of his proposed lost civilization. In Hancock's view, the surviving members of the advanced Ice Age culture would have traveled to different regions after the Younger Dryas Catastrophe, seeking to preserve their knowledge and rebuild some semblance of what was lost. They would have settled among local hunter-gatherer populations, perhaps marrying into these communities, and over generations, they would have taught their hosts the skills and knowledge they carried. At Göbekli Tepe, Hancock suggests, we're seeing the result of this cultural transmission. The site was built by the local population, but under the guidance and direction of people who possessed advanced architectural knowledge. The missing developmental history isn't missing because it was lost to time, it's missing because it took place elsewhere, in the now destroyed civilization that flourished during the Ice Age. Göbekli Tepe represents not the beginning of architectural sophistication, but the transfer of existing knowledge to a new context. This interpretation is controversial, to put it mildly. Professor Necmi Karol, who has led excavations at the nearby site of Karahan Tepe, another impressive Neolithic complex in the same region, strongly disputes Hancock's reading. He argues that the builders of these sites were sophisticated in their own right, that we shouldn't underestimate what hunter-gatherer societies were capable of achieving. The absence of earlier examples of megalithic construction, Karol and other archaeologists suggest, simply means we haven't found them yet, or that the development of these techniques happened relatively quickly once certain social and cognitive thresholds were crossed. Moreover, there is evidence of earlier architectural development in the region, just not in the form of massive stone monuments. The Natufian culture, which flourished in the Levant from about 12,500 to 9,500 years ago, built permanent settlements and showed evidence of planning and geometric thinking in their architecture. The sophistication seen at Göbekli Tepe may have built on this Natufian foundation, representing a next step in architectural development rather than a sudden transfer of knowledge from an outside source. But here's where the debate gets interesting, because even skeptical archaeologists admit that Göbekli Tepe forces us to rethink some fundamental assumptions about the development of human civilization. The old narrative of agriculture first, then cities, then temples clearly doesn't apply here. At Göbekli Tepe, the temple came first, and some researchers now argue that it may have been the desire or need to gather at ritual centers like Göbekli Tepe that actually drove the development of agriculture, rather than the other way around. If large groups needed to gather regularly at these ceremonial sites, they would need reliable food sources nearby. This might have created pressure to develop agriculture to support the gatherings. This is revolutionary enough without invoking lost civilizations. It suggests that religion and ritual, rather than purely practical concerns about food production, may have been a driving force in the development of civilization. It challenges the materialist interpretation that has dominated archaeology for decades, and it demonstrates that our understanding of prehistory is far from complete. For Hancock, though, the implications go further. Göbekli Tepe is not an isolated case. Similar sites have been discovered throughout the region, collectively known as the Taş Tepeler, or Stone Hills. Karahan Tepe, Nevali Chori, and others show similar architectural sophistication and similar dates. And beyond Turkey, Hancock points to other sites around the world that seem to demonstrate surprising levels of knowledge or capability for their supposed time periods. In Indonesia, there's Gunung Padang, a massive structure built on a mountainside that some researchers claim dates back over 20,000 years, making it far older than any known civilization. In Malta, there are the megalithic temples of Kadgantija and Ajar Kiem, built by a Neolithic culture and demonstrating remarkable stoneworking skill. In Egypt, there's the Great Sphinx, which some researchers, including geologist Robert Schoch, argue shows evidence of water erosion that could only have occurred during a much wetter period, potentially placing its construction thousands of years before the conventional date. Each of these sites is controversial. Mainstream archaeologists contest the dating, the interpretations, and the claims of anomalous sophistication. But taken together, Hancock argues, they paint a picture of a world where knowledge and capabilities appeared earlier and spread more widely than conventional history allows. And at the center of this picture, providing the explanation for all these anomalies, is his lost Ice Age civilization. The problem, critics counter, is that Hancock is essentially arguing from ignorance, because we don't fully understand how Göbekli Tepe was built, because we're surprised by its sophistication, because it doesn't fit neatly into our previous narratives. Hancock concludes that it must be evidence of outside intervention from a lost civilization. But surprise and lack of complete understanding don't constitute proof. They constitute gaps in our knowledge, and as history has shown repeatedly, gaps in knowledge get filled by research and discovery, not by invoking hypothetical civilizations for which no direct evidence exists. The debate over Göbekli Tepe and similar sites ultimately comes down to a question of interpretation and worldview. Do these sites represent the remarkable achievements of indigenous populations working within their own cultural and technological contexts? Or do they represent the transfer of knowledge from an earlier, more advanced civilization? Your answer to this question depends largely on what you find more plausible: that human ingenuity and capability emerged at different times and places as conditions allowed, or that an advanced civilization rose and fell before recorded history, leaving only subtle traces of its existence. What's undeniable is that Göbekli Tepe has changed the conversation. It's forced archaeologists to reconsider their assumptions, it's sparked new research into the capabilities of Neolithic peoples, and it's provided Graham Hancock with what he considers his strongest piece of evidence. Whether that evidence actually supports his theory of a lost Ice Age civilization, or simply demonstrates that human history is more complex and surprising than we thought, that remains very much a matter of debate. But the mystery of Göbekli Tepe endures, carved in stone on a windswept hill in Turkey, silent testament to achievements that continue to challenge and inspire us thousands of years after they were created. To truly understand Graham Hancock's theory about Atlantis, we need to examine what he believes this lost civilization actually was. What did it look like? How did it function? What technologies did it possess? And perhaps most importantly, how does it differ from later civilizations like Egypt and Mesopotamia that we can study directly? These questions are crucial because critics often attack Hancock for being vague about the specifics of his proposed civilization. So let's explore what Hancock actually claims about these lost people and the world they inhabited. First and foremost, Hancock's lost civilization was maritime in nature. This is central to understanding why so little physical evidence remains and why the civilization was so vulnerable to the catastrophe that destroyed it. During the Ice Age, with massive amounts of water locked up in glaciers, sea levels were 300 to 400 feet lower than they are today. This exposed vast areas of coastal land that are now underwater. The continental shelves, those relatively shallow underwater extensions of continents, were dry land, and in many cases, these areas would have been prime real estate, fertile and temperate, with easy access to both marine and terrestrial resources. Hancock argues that his proposed civilization developed along these now submerged coastlines. They were seafarers, navigating the oceans, trading across vast distances, and establishing settlements on coasts around the world. This maritime focus would have been both their strength and their weakness. It allowed them to spread their culture and knowledge widely, but it also meant that when sea levels rose dramatically at the end of the Ice Age, their cities and settlements were swallowed by the ocean. The rising waters, driven by melting ice and possibly accelerated by the proposed comet impacts, would have erased most traces of their civilization, leaving only those settlements that happened to be at higher elevations or far inland. The technology of this civilization, in Hancock's view, was sophisticated but not modern in the science fiction sense. They weren't flying spacecraft or building nuclear reactors, but they had advanced knowledge in several key areas. They were expert astronomers, having observed the skies for millennia and developed sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics. They could predict eclipses, track the precession of the equinoxes, and encode astronomical data in monuments and myths. They were skilled engineers, capable of precise stonework and capable of moving and positioning enormous stones with techniques that remain mysterious even today. They had advanced mathematical knowledge, understanding principles of geometry, proportion, and calculation that wouldn't be rediscovered until classical Greek times or later. Crucially, they had developed or were developing early forms of writing or symbolic notation, ways to record information and preserve knowledge across generations. This writing may have been carved in stone or recorded on more perishable materials that haven't survived, and they had what Hancock sometimes calls spiritual technology, sophisticated practices involving altered states of consciousness, shamanic techniques, and perhaps the use of psychoactive plants to achieve insights and visions. This last element became increasingly important in Hancock's later work, particularly his book Supernatural, where he explored the role of consciousness and altered states in human cognitive development. What the civilization apparently lacked, or what hasn't survived in the archaeological record, were many of the markers we typically associate with advanced cultures. There's no evidence of metal tools, though Hancock suggests this might be because the civilization hadn't yet developed metallurgy, or because metal tools were rare and precious, and thus unlikely to be lost casually where archaeologists might find them. There's no evidence of writing in the form we would recognize, though Hancock argues that symbolic systems carved on ancient monuments might represent proto-writing or encoded information. There's no evidence of cities in the conventional sense, though again, Hancock would argue that the cities were on the coastlines and are now underwater. This creates an interesting paradox at the heart of Hancock's theory. He needs the civilization to be advanced enough to explain the anomalies he sees in the archaeological record, the astronomical knowledge, the sophisticated stonework, the apparent transfer of techniques and information across vast distances. But the civilization can't be so advanced that its absence from the archaeological record becomes completely implausible. It's a delicate balance, and critics argue that Hancock moves the goalposts as needed, claiming high sophistication when it supports his argument, but pulling back to more primitive capabilities when the lack of evidence becomes too glaring. Hancock would counter that this paradox is artificial, a product of our modern assumptions about what civilization must look like. We tend to think that technology progresses in a linear fashion, that advanced astronomy implies advanced metallurgy, that monumental architecture requires writing and complex bureaucracy. But what if development was more uneven? What if a culture could achieve great sophistication in some areas while remaining relatively simple in others? What if the path to civilization taken by this Ice Age culture was fundamentally different from the path taken by later civilizations like Egypt and Mesopotamia? This brings us to another key aspect of Hancock's theory, the role of this lost civilization as a sort of mother culture, a source of knowledge and inspiration for later civilizations. Hancock doesn't claim that the Egyptians, the Sumerians, the Mayans, and other ancient peoples were simply colonies or outposts of the lost civilization. Rather, he argues that survivors from the Ice Age culture brought their knowledge to different regions and shared it with local populations. Over time, this knowledge was adapted and integrated into local contexts, mixed with indigenous traditions and innovations, and became the foundation for the great civilizations of the ancient world. This explains, in Hancock's view, why we see similar themes and motifs across ancient cultures that supposedly had no contact with each other. The flood myths aren't coincidence or universal archetypes emerging independently. They're memories of the real catastrophe that destroyed the mother culture. The legends of civilizing gods aren't just mythology. They're distorted recollections of real people, the survivors who taught agriculture, astronomy, and architecture to hunter-gatherers around the world. The astronomical alignments found in monuments on different continents aren't coincidence or simple sun-watching by primitive people. They're evidence of a shared knowledge base, brought by the survivors and preserved in stone as a way to transmit information to future generations. One of the most intriguing aspects of Hancock's theory is his suggestion that some of this knowledge was deliberately encoded as a warning to the future. He argues that the survivors understood that the catastrophe that had destroyed their civilization could happen again, that Earth was vulnerable to cosmic impacts and that future humans needed to be warned. So they created monuments that incorporated astronomical information, particularly information about precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that causes the positions of stars to shift gradually over thousands of years. By encoding precessional data in monuments, they created a kind of time capsule, a message that could only be understood by a civilization that had developed sufficient astronomical knowledge to recognize what was being communicated. This warning aspect of the theory has become increasingly prominent in Hancock's recent work. It transforms his quest from mere historical curiosity into something with contemporary relevance. If the monuments really do encode warnings about cosmic catastrophes, and if we're finally developing the knowledge to understand these warnings, then ignoring Hancock's theories isn't just academic stubbornness, it's potentially putting humanity at risk. It's a powerful rhetorical move that elevates the stakes considerably. Critics, of course, see this very differently. They argue that Hancock is essentially creating an unfalsifiable theory, one that can't be disproven because any absence of evidence can be explained away. The civilization left few traces because they were maritime, and their cities are underwater. They didn't develop certain technologies because they followed a different developmental path. Their writing hasn't been recognized because it's encoded in symbols we haven't learned to read. The astronomical knowledge was passed on orally or through initiatory practices. Every gap in evidence, every missing element that you'd expect from an advanced civilization, has an explanation that keeps the theory alive. Moreover, critics argue that Hancock's theory robs indigenous peoples of credit for their own achievements. When he suggests that the Mayans learned astronomy from survivors of a lost civilization, or that the megalithic builders of Malta were guided by outside knowledge, or that the sudden development of agriculture in multiple locations was due to teaching by survivors, he's implicitly saying that these peoples couldn't have achieved these things on their own. This is uncomfortable territory, echoing colonialist narratives about primitive peoples needing white civilizers to teach them the arts of culture. Hancock vehemently denies any racist intent, pointing out that his proposed Ice Age civilization would likely have included people of many ethnicities, and that he's simply following the evidence where it leads. But the criticism persists. What's clear is that Hancock has constructed a comprehensive, coherent narrative that explains at least to his satisfaction and that of his many followers, a wide range of anomalies and mysteries in the archaeological and geological record. Whether this narrative is correct is another matter entirely. The civilization he describes is tantalizing, plausible enough to be believable but mysterious enough to be fascinating. It's a civilization that achieved remarkable things but fell to cosmic catastrophe before it could fully develop. Its survivors became the heroes and gods of later mythologies, teaching and guiding but gradually being absorbed into other cultures until their origins were forgotten. It's a story that resonates deeply with something in the human psyche, the sense that we've forgotten something important, that there's hidden knowledge waiting to be rediscovered, that history is deeper and stranger than the official accounts admit. Whether it's true history or inspired fiction, whether it's groundbreaking archaeology or pseudoscientific fantasy, Hancock's vision of this lost Ice Age civilization has captured the imagination of millions. And as we're about to explore, he hasn't just relied on theory and interpretation. He's gone looking for physical evidence, diving beneath the waves to search for the submerged cities he believes must exist. Graham Hancock hasn't been content to simply theorize about a lost civilization from the comfort of his desk. He's spent decades traveling the world, visiting ancient sites, diving in oceans and inland waters, and searching for physical evidence to support his theories. This hands-on approach is part of what makes his work so compelling to his audience. He's not an armchair theorist. He's an investigator, getting his hands dirty, or in many cases, getting soaking wet in his quest for proof. Let's explore some of the key pieces of evidence Hancock points to and examine what they might or might not tell us about the past. We've already discussed Göbekli Tepe, but it's worth emphasizing again how central this site is to Hancock's argument. Here is undeniable proof that Neolithic hunter-gatherers achieved architectural sophistication thousands of years before conventional chronology suggested possible. Whether you accept Hancock's interpretation of outside influence or you believe this represents purely indigenous achievement, the fact remains that Göbekli Tepe has forced archaeologists to revise their timelines and assumptions. This is exactly what Hancock has been arguing for, that the conventional chronology is wrong, that sophistication appeared earlier than mainstream archaeology believed. Göbekli Tepe proves that point, even if it doesn't necessarily prove the specific mechanism Hancock proposes for how that sophistication arose. Beyond Göbekli Tepe, Hancock points to a number of underwater sites that he believes may represent ruins from his proposed lost civilization. The most famous of these is the Yonaguni Monument off the coast of Japan. Discovered in 1986 by dive tour operator Kihachiro Aratake, the Yonaguni structure consists of massive, angular stone formations that some researchers believe show clear evidence of human modification and construction. The formations include what appear to be terraces, steps, walls, and even carved faces or figures. Hancock visited Yonaguni multiple times for his documentary series Underworld, diving the site and examining the structures firsthand. He argues that while some of the features could be natural, the result of geological processes and erosion, others show clear signs of human work. The straight edges, the right angles, the apparent tool marks, the arrangement of certain elements, all these suggest to Hancock that the Yonaguni structure was at least partially man-made. If so, its age becomes crucial. The site has been underwater since sea levels rose at the end of the Ice Age, which means any human construction would have to date back at least 10,000 years, placing it squarely in the time frame of Hancock's proposed lost civilization. Mainstream geologists who have examined Yonaguni, however, conclude that the features are entirely natural, the result of geological stratification and erosion patterns in the local sandstone. The rocks in the area naturally fracture along regular planes, creating formations that can look surprisingly geometric and artificial. Underwater erosion, particularly strong currents along the sea floor, can accentuate these natural features, creating straight edges and flat surfaces. Similar natural formations exist elsewhere, the Giant's Causeway in Ireland being one famous example, and no one suggests those required human construction. The debate over Yonaguni encapsulates a recurring issue in Hancock's work. When examining photographs or video footage, especially for people without geological expertise, the formations really do look artificial. It's easy to see why Hancock and others believe they must be man-made. But geological experts, with their understanding of how rocks fracture and erode, can explain the features through entirely natural processes. Who's right? Without definitive evidence like tool marks that can be clearly distinguished from natural erosion, or artifacts found in clear association with the structures, it's difficult to say with certainty, and therein lies the challenge. Absence of proof isn't proof of absence, but it's also not proof of presence. Hancock has investigated other underwater sites as well. Off the coast of India near Mahabalipuram, sonar surveys and diving expeditions have revealed submerged structures that some believe could be ancient ruins. In the Mediterranean, various formations have been proposed as possible evidence of lost civilizations. In the Bahamas, the Bimini Road, a linear arrangement of limestone blocks on the seafloor, was once championed by some as evidence of Atlantis. Though most geologists now agree it's a natural formation called beach rock, the pattern is consistent. Hancock sees evidence of human construction. Mainstream experts see natural formations. The debate continues. And without smoking gun evidence, clear artifact deposits, or unmistakable human workmanship, the mystery remains unsolved. This frustrates Hancock, who feels that the archaeological establishment isn't taking the underwater evidence seriously enough, isn't conducting the kind of thorough research that might definitively prove or disprove claims about underwater ruins. But searching underwater is expensive, time-consuming, and technically challenging. Archaeological excavation is hard enough on dry land. Doing it underwater, often at significant depths and in poor visibility, multiplies the difficulties enormously. Most archaeological funding goes to sites that are accessible and that fit within conventional chronologies and research paradigms. Spending limited resources on speculative underwater sites that may turn out to be nothing more than natural formations is a hard sell, especially when there are countless known sites on land still waiting to be excavated and studied. Beyond underwater sites, Hancock points to the precision stonework found in various ancient monuments as evidence of sophisticated knowledge. The Great Pyramid of Giza, with its precise alignment to true north and its incorporation of mathematical constants like pi and phi in its dimensions, suggests knowledge far beyond what we'd expect from a culture that supposedly used only copper tools and simple mathematics. The massive blocks at Sacsayhuaman in Peru, fitted together so perfectly that you can't slide a knife blade between them, demonstrate engineering capabilities that challenge conventional understanding. The megaliths at Baalbek in Lebanon, including stones weighing over 1,000 tons, raise questions about how ancient peoples moved and positioned such massive weights. In each case, mainstream archaeologists and engineers have proposed explanations for how these achievements were possible using the technologies known to be available at the time. Copper tools, though softer than steel, can be used to shape granite if you're patient and have enough manpower. Large stones can be moved using rollers, levers, ramps, and massive numbers of workers. Precision can be achieved through careful measurement and trial and error refinement. The ancient peoples who built these structures were, by all evidence, intelligent, creative, and capable of solving complex engineering problems. But Hancock asks whether we're being too quick to assume conventional explanations. What if some of these structures weren't built using only the technologies visible in the archaeological record? What if they incorporated techniques or knowledge passed down from an earlier tradition, from his proposed Ice Age civilization? What if the builders were working from a template or design that originated thousands of years earlier? It's a difficult question to answer definitively because we can't observe the construction process. We can only examine the finished product and work backward to imagine how it might have been done. And when the finished product is impressive enough, multiple explanations become possible. The conventional explanation may be correct, or the alternative explanation may be correct, or the truth may lie somewhere in between, with ancient peoples using techniques we haven't fully understood or reconstructed. The same interpretive challenges apply to Hancock's arguments about astronomical alignments. He points out that numerous ancient monuments and sites are aligned with astronomical phenomena, solstices and equinoxes, the rising positions of certain stars, celestial events like eclipses. The Great Pyramid's shafts point to specific stars. The layout of the three Giza pyramids matches the belt of Orion. Angkor Wat in Cambodia is laid out to mirror the constellation Draco. Chichen Itza in Mexico has a pyramid where the play of light and shadow on the equinoxes creates the appearance of a serpent descending the steps. To Hancock, These alignments demonstrate sophisticated astronomical knowledge and suggest a common source of information, his lost civilization teaching the secrets of the stars to different cultures around the world. Critics counter that some of these alignments are coincidental, that with enough monuments and enough possible astronomical targets, you're bound to find matches by chance. They also point out that many ancient cultures were skilled astronomers in their own right, motivated by agricultural needs, religious beliefs, and simple curiosity about the heavens. The fact that different cultures align their monuments to astronomical events doesn't require a common outside source. It simply reflects the universal human fascination with the sky and the practical importance of tracking seasons. Hancock has also drawn on the work of geologist Robert Schoch, who has proposed that the Sphinx of Giza shows evidence of water erosion that could only have occurred during a period of much higher rainfall, potentially placing the Sphinx's construction back to 10,500 years ago or earlier. If true, this would be revolutionary, predating Egyptian dynastic civilization by thousands of years, and suggesting that the Giza Plateau had significance long before the pyramids were built. Mainstream Egyptologists and geologists dispute Schoch's interpretation, arguing that the erosion patterns can be explained by other processes and that there's no credible evidence for such an early date. Mainstream Egyptologists and geologists dispute Schoch's interpretation, arguing that the erosion patterns can be explained by other processes and that there's no credible evidence for such an early date. Similarly, Hancock has championed the work of researchers in Indonesia who claim that Gunung Padang, a stepped pyramid structure on Java, could be as old as 27,000 years based on geological surveys and core samples. If confirmed, this would make it the oldest man-made structure on Earth by a vast margin. But these claims are highly controversial, with many geologists arguing that the surveys are being misinterpreted and that what's being identified as ancient construction is actually natural geological formation that was later modified by humans in more recent times. In each case, the pattern is similar. Hancock identifies evidence that seems to suggest greater antiquity or sophistication than conventional chronology allows. He assembles this evidence into a narrative of lost civilization. Mainstream experts examine the same evidence and find conventional explanations adequate, or they dispute the dating, the interpretation, or the methodology used to generate the claims. The debate becomes polarized, with each side accusing the other of bias and closed-mindedness. What's often lost in this polarized debate is nuance. It's possible that Hancock is right that some sites are older or more sophisticated than currently recognized, without that necessarily proving his entire theory about a global Ice Age civilization. It's possible that mainstream archaeology is too conservative in some of its dating and interpretations, while still being fundamentally correct about the broad outlines of human prehistory. It's possible that human capabilities and achievements were more varied and advanced earlier than we thought, without needing to invoke a lost mother civilization to explain them. The evidence Hancock presents is intriguing. Some of it is genuinely puzzling and deserves more attention and research than it's received. But intriguing and puzzling don't automatically equal proof of a lost civilization. They equal mysteries that need investigation, questions that need answers. And in science, the process of investigation and questioning is ongoing. New discoveries do change our understanding, the discovery of Göbekli Tepe being a perfect example. But these changes happen through accumulation of evidence, through replication of results, through peer review and critical examination, not through individual claims that fail to convince the broader expert community. Hancock would argue that the expert community is itself the problem, that mainstream archaeology is too wedded to its current paradigms to honestly evaluate evidence that challenges those paradigms. And there's some truth to this criticism. Science does sometimes resist revolutionary ideas, and the history of science includes examples of valid theories being initially rejected. But it also includes thousands of examples of fringe theories that deserve to be rejected because they weren't supported by evidence. The challenge is distinguishing between the two, between ideas that are revolutionary and ideas that are simply wrong. For now, the evidence remains contested, the interpretations remain in dispute, and Graham Hancock continues searching, investigating, and arguing for his lost civilization while his critics continue pushing back. The truth, whatever it turns out to be, likely lies somewhere in the complex middle ground between absolute acceptance and absolute rejection. And that's where we turn next, to explore the mythology and meaning of the flood stories that Hancock sees as memories of real catastrophe, and to understand how these ancient narratives fit into his broader theory about what happened at the dawn of human history. The flood myths that appear in cultures around the world form a crucial pillar of Graham Hancock's argument for a lost civilization destroyed by catastrophe. These stories, he argues, aren't just universal archetypes or simple explanations for local flooding events. They're memories, distorted by thousands of years of oral transmission but preserving the core truth of a real global catastrophe that nearly wiped out humanity. Let's examine these myths and what they might or might not tell us about the deep past. The most famous flood narrative in Western culture is the story of Noah's Ark from the Hebrew Bible. God, seeing the wickedness of humanity, decides to destroy the world with a flood, but commands the righteous Noah to build an ark and save his family along with pairs of all animal species. The rains come, the earth is flooded, and everything not on the ark is destroyed. After the waters recede, Noah's family repopulates the earth. It's a story of divine judgment and renewal, of catastrophe and survival. But the Noah story wasn't original to Hebrew tradition. It was adapted from earlier Mesopotamian flood narratives, particularly the Epic of Gilgamesh. In that Sumerian and later Babylonian epic, a character named Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh how the gods decided to destroy humanity with a flood. The god Ea warned Utnapishtim in a dream and instructed him to build a massive boat to save himself, his family, and examples of all living things. The flood came, lasting 6 days and 7 nights, destroying everything on earth. When the waters finally subsided, Utnapishtim sent out birds to search for dry land, just as Noah would later do in the biblical version. The boat came to rest on a mountain, and Utnapishtim made a sacrifice to the gods. The parallels between these two flood narratives are obvious, and scholars generally agree that the biblical account was influenced by or adapted from the earlier Mesopotamian tradition. But the story of a great flood doesn't end with the Middle East. Similar narratives appear in cultures around the world, often with striking similarities in their core elements. In Greek mythology, Zeus decides to destroy the corrupt human race with a flood, but the titan Prometheus warns his son Deucalion, who builds an ark and survives along with his wife Pyrrha. In Hindu mythology, Manu is warned by a fish about an impending flood that will destroy all life, and he builds a boat to survive. After the flood, Manu becomes the ancestor of the new human race. In South American legends, particularly among various Andean peoples, there are stories of great floods that destroyed earlier versions of humanity. The Inca told of a flood that rose to cover even the highest mountains, destroying all people except for a shepherd and his family who were warned in advance and survived by taking shelter on the highest peak. In North America, many Native American tribes have flood narratives. The Ojibwe tell of a great flood from which the trickster Nanabozo saved the animals and recreated the earth. The Haida of the Pacific Northwest have multiple flood stories, often involving survival by climbing to high ground or taking refuge in canoes. Even in places as far-flung as Australia, Aboriginal traditions include stories of great floods that reshaped the landscape and destroyed earlier peoples. The sheer ubiquity of flood narratives across human cultures is undeniable. Hancock argues this cannot be coincidence, cannot be explained away as universal archetypes or the result of observing local river flooding. The specific details, the global scope, the emphasis on survival and renewal, all point to a common source, a shared memory of a real catastrophic flood that affected peoples around the world. Critics offer several counter-arguments to this interpretation. First, they point out that while flood stories are common, they're not universal, and the details vary enormously from culture to culture. Some floods destroy the whole world, others are regional, some result from divine judgment, others are natural catastrophes or accidents. Some emphasize survival through boats, others through climbing to high ground or other means. If all these stories were memories of the same event, wouldn't we expect more consistency in the details? Second, critics argue that humans have always lived near water, near rivers, coasts, and lakes, because water is essential for survival. And wherever humans live near water, they occasionally experience catastrophic flooding. Major river floods, storm surges, tsunamis, these events would have been traumatic and memorable, worthy of being preserved in story and legend. The fact that many cultures have flood myths can be explained simply by the fact that many cultures have experienced significant floods. Third, the similarities between flood myths might result from diffusion rather than common origin in a single prehistoric event. Stories travel, cultures trade and interact, ideas and narratives spread from one group to another. The Mesopotamian flood narrative likely influenced not only the biblical version but also other stories in the region. Greek flood myths may have been influenced by Middle Eastern narratives through trade and cultural contact. The pattern of similarities doesn't require a prehistoric global flood. It only requires that stories spread across cultures over time. Hancock counters these arguments by emphasizing the antiquity and geographic spread of the narratives. Some of these stories existed in oral traditions for thousands of years before being written down. They appear in cultures that had no known contact with each other. Indigenous American peoples and Asian peoples, Pacific Islanders, and Middle Eastern civilizations. The flood motif seems to be too widespread, too consistent in its basic elements, to be explained solely by diffusion or independent invention based on local experiences. Moreover, Hancock points to geological evidence that supports the reality of massive flooding at the end of the Ice Age. When the ice sheets melted, sea levels rose approximately 400 feet. This wasn't a gradual process spread evenly over thousands of years. Recent research suggests that much of this sea level rise occurred in dramatic pulses, periods when massive amounts of ice melted rapidly, causing sudden and catastrophic rises in ocean levels. These events, particularly dramatic ones like Meltwater Pulse 1A around 14,600 years ago and Meltwater Pulse 1B around 11,000 years ago, would have been genuinely apocalyptic for coastal populations. Imagine living in a coastal settlement when a meltwater pulse hits. The sea level doesn't rise gradually over generations. Within human lifetimes, perhaps even within years or decades, visible changes occur. Communities that had lived by the sea for generations would find their homes threatened by flooding, their lands gradually or suddenly submerged, depending on the speed and scale of the event. They would be forced to retreat inland, abandoning ancestral territories. Such dramatic environmental changes would certainly be traumatic and memorable, worthy of being preserved in story and legend. Survivors would carry memories of these catastrophes, and over generations of retelling, Hancock argues, the stories might grow in scope and scale, transforming from remembered regional disasters into mythological global floods. This explanation, Hancock argues, would account for the widespread flood myths without requiring either pure coincidence or simple diffusion. There really were catastrophic floods and dramatic sea level changes at the end of the Ice Age. This is established by geological evidence. Peoples around the world likely did experience traumatic coastal changes that destroyed settlements. In Hancock's view, these memories were preserved in myth and legend, mixed with religious and cultural elements, and passed down through generations. The flood myths, he proposes, aren't pure fiction but rather history transformed into mythology, though disentangling historical memory from cultural storytelling remains extraordinarily difficult. But Hancock goes further than conventional geological explanations. He argues that the most dramatic flooding didn't result simply from gradual ice melt, but from the comet impacts he believes triggered the Younger Dryas. In his scenario, multiple fragments hitting the ice sheets would have instantly vaporized enormous amounts of ice, creating floods beyond anything from conventional melting processes. These impacts, he proposes, would have generated tsunamis that raced across oceans, devastating coastlines thousands of miles away. The atmospheric effects, the dust and vapor thrown into the sky, could have produced torrential rains that lasted for days or weeks. This, Hancock suggests, would better explain the dramatic and catastrophic nature of the flood myths, not gradual sea level rise but cosmic catastrophe, impact-driven devastation on a scale that nearly ended human civilization entirely. However, it's important to note that this interpretation extends beyond what the geological evidence definitively supports, and most geologists find conventional explanations for sea level rise adequate without invoking cosmic impacts. It's a dramatic narrative, and it explains not just the existence of flood myths but their particular character. The emphasis on sudden destruction, on divine or cosmic causes, on near-total annihilation followed by difficult survival and rebuilding, If survivors of Hancock's proposed Ice Age civilization experienced this catastrophe, if they watched their world literally destroyed by fire and flood, they would certainly have preserved the memory. And as these survivors spread across the world, settling among different populations and teaching them the skills they possessed, they would have brought this story with them. Over thousands of years, as languages diverged and cultures developed their own distinct identities, the story would be adapted and modified, but the core elements would remain: the memory of the great catastrophe that divided the old world from the new. Critics remain skeptical. They point out that dramatic stories about catastrophe are compelling and memorable, which might explain their prevalence without requiring a single historical source. They note that the interpretation of myths as historical records is fraught with difficulty. Myths encode cultural values and religious beliefs as much as or more than historical events, and untangling what might be historical memory from what is pure storytelling is nearly impossible. And they emphasize that while flooding at the end of the Ice Age was real, there's no evidence it was sudden enough or universal enough to create the kind of shared catastrophic memory Hancock proposes. The debate over flood myths ultimately mirrors the larger debate over Hancock's work. If you're inclined to believe in the lost civilization, the myths serve as compelling supporting evidence, oral traditions preserving memories of real events. If you're skeptical of the lost civilization, the myths are interesting cultural artifacts but not reliable historical evidence. And like so much else in this story, the truth resists simple resolution. The myths exist. They spread across cultures and continents. They share common elements. But whether they all point back to a single prehistoric catastrophe or emerge from complex combinations of real local events, cultural diffusion, and human storytelling genius, that question remains as mysterious as the civilizations that first told these stories. Few figures in the world of archaeology and ancient history provoke as much heated debate as Graham Hancock. His theories about lost civilizations have made him a best-selling author and a media phenomenon, but they've also made him a target for sustained criticism from the archaeological establishment. This controversy isn't just about competing interpretations of evidence. It's become a culture war, with accusations flying in both directions and little middle ground between defenders and detractors. Understanding this controversy is essential to understanding Hancock's work and its impact on how we think about the past. The most common criticism leveled at Hancock is that he practices pseudo-archaeology, presenting speculative theories as if they were established fact, cherry-picking evidence that supports his views while ignoring contradictory evidence, and misrepresenting or misunderstanding actual archaeological research. The Society for American Archaeology, one of the largest professional archaeological organizations, issued a statement strongly condemning Hancock's Netflix series Ancient Apocalypse, calling it harmful to the discipline and accusing it of promoting ideas with racist undertones. These are serious charges, and they deserve serious examination. Let's start with the accusation of pseudo-archaeology. What does that actually mean? Pseudo-archaeology refers to archaeological claims or theories that fall outside the accepted methods and standards of professional archaeology. It typically involves speculation not grounded in empirical evidence, rejection of established dating methods and scientific findings, and often a conspiratorial worldview where mainstream archaeologists are portrayed as deliberately suppressing the truth. Critics argue that Hancock fits this description. He has no formal training in archaeology or related fields. His theories rely heavily on interpreting monuments and artifacts in ways that professional archaeologists reject. He proposes dates for structures and events that contradict established chronologies based on multiple independent dating methods. He suggests that mainstream archaeology is resistant to new ideas and unwilling to fairly evaluate evidence that challenges conventional views. And perhaps most damningly, his theory requires the existence of an entire civilization, for which there is no direct, unambiguous physical evidence, no cities, no clear artifact assemblages, no undisputed remains. Hancock's response to these accusations is multifaceted. First, he argues that he's never claimed to be an archaeologist. He's a journalist and researcher, investigating mysteries and presenting his findings to a popular audience. He's not conducting excavations or publishing in peer-reviewed archaeological journals. He's exploring ideas, connecting dots, asking questions that he believes deserve answers. The fact that professional archaeologists disagree with his conclusions doesn't make him a pseudo-archaeologist. It makes him a controversial researcher whose theories challenge the mainstream. Second, Hancock argues that archaeology as a discipline has a history of resisting new ideas and attacking those who challenge established narratives. He points to the examples we mentioned earlier, Brett's and his catastrophic flooding theory, Wegener and continental drift, the Alvarezes, and the asteroid impact that killed the dinosaurs. In each case, revolutionary ideas were initially rejected by the establishment before eventually being accepted. Hancock positions himself as following in this tradition, a lone voice challenging orthodoxy in the name of truth. Third, Hancock argues that many of his specific claims have been vindicated, or at least supported by new discoveries. Göbekli Tepe proved that monumental architecture appeared thousands of years earlier than mainstream archaeology believed possible. The Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis, while still controversial, has gained support from some mainstream scientists and has been published in peer-reviewed journals. Underwater archaeology has revealed submerged structures and settlements that demonstrate humans were living and building on now flooded coastlines. In Hancock's view, his broad theory may not be fully accepted, but piece by piece, the evidence is accumulating in ways that support his perspective. The racism charge is particularly contentious and painful for Hancock. Critics argue that his theory, by suggesting that ancient peoples around the world received their civilizing knowledge from an outside source, perpetuates the colonialist narrative that indigenous peoples couldn't have developed sophisticated cultures on their own. This narrative has a dark history. It was used to justify European colonialism, to dismiss and denigrate non-European cultures, and to claim that any impressive achievements in Africa, Asia, or the Americas must have been the work of white outsiders. Whether those were ancient Egyptians, Phoenicians, lost tribes of Israel, or sunken Atlanteans, Hancock vehemently denies any racist intent or implication in his work. He points out that he's never specified the ethnicity of his proposed lost civilization, and argues that a maritime culture spread across the world would necessarily have included people of many different backgrounds. He emphasizes that his theory doesn't demean the achievements of any culture, it simply proposes that knowledge was shared and transmitted in complex ways across millennia. And he argues that his critics are projecting racist interpretations onto his work rather than reading what he actually wrote. But the concern persists among archaeologists and indigenous groups. When Ancient Apocalypse planned to film episodes in North America, numerous indigenous American organizations protested, arguing that Hancock's theories misrepresented their history and culture. The filmmakers ultimately canceled these plans in response to the outcry. Native scholars pointed out that they have detailed oral traditions about their origins and history, traditions that tell very different stories from Hancock's narrative of outside teachers bringing civilization. Dismissing or overriding these traditions in favor of a theory about lost white civilizers, even if that's not Hancock's intent, feels like yet another example of colonialism and cultural erasure. This is where the debate becomes particularly fraught, because it's not just about evidence and interpretation anymore. It's about power, voice, and whose story gets told. Professional archaeology has been working hard in recent decades to decolonize the discipline, to partner with indigenous communities rather than treating them as objects of study, to respect indigenous knowledge and oral traditions, to acknowledge the harms done by earlier generations of archaeologists who literally dug up indigenous graves and carted off cultural treasures to distant museums. In this context, a theory that suggests indigenous achievements were actually the result of teaching by an ancient lost civilization, regardless of how that theory is intended, feels like a step backward. Hancock argues that his theory is being mischaracterized, that he's never claimed indigenous peoples weren't capable of developing their own cultures, only that there was an exchange of ideas and knowledge from an earlier source. But critics respond that this is a distinction without a difference. If the impressive achievements of ancient cultures are attributed to outside influence, it doesn't matter whether you explicitly call indigenous peoples incapable or simply argue that they had help. The effect is the same, diminishing their agency and their accomplishments. The controversy exploded into mainstream view with the release of Ancient Apocalypse on Netflix in November 2022. The series, featuring Hancock traveling to ancient sites around the world to explore evidence for his theories, became wildly popular, reaching Netflix's top 10 in 31 countries and accumulating tens of millions of viewing hours. but it also triggered an unprecedented backlash from the archaeological community. Multiple archaeological organizations issued statements condemning the series. Archaeologists wrote articles and blog posts explaining why Hancock's claims were wrong or misleading. Several archaeologists who were interviewed for the series complained that their footage was edited in misleading ways or used out of context to make it appear they were supporting ideas they actually rejected. The hashtag archaeologists began trending on social media as professional archaeologists shared their work and tried to counter what they saw as misinformation spread by the show. The intensity of this response reveals something important about the stakes in this debate. Archaeologists feel that shows like Ancient Apocalypse undermine public trust in their field. If millions of people are told that archaeologists are close-minded guardians of orthodoxy who refuse to consider evidence that challenges their worldview, it makes it harder for archaeologists to do their jobs, to secure funding, to communicate their findings to the public, to be seen as legitimate experts rather than merely one voice among many in a sea of speculation. Moreover, archaeologists argue that Hancock's theories, by casting doubt on the mainstream understanding of prehistory, feed into broader trends of anti-intellectualism and rejection of expertise. In an era when scientific expertise on climate change, vaccines, and countless other issues is being questioned or dismissed, the idea that professional archaeologists can't be trusted to accurately describe the human past fits into a dangerous pattern. If you can't trust archaeologists about the past, why trust scientists about anything? Hancock, for his part, sees the backlash as validation. He argues that the intensity of the response proves he's touching a nerve, that the archaeological establishment feels threatened because his ideas are gaining traction and exposing weaknesses in conventional narratives. He's framed himself as an underdog fighting against entrenched power, a David against the Goliath of mainstream academia. And for many of his followers, this narrative is compelling. Who doesn't love a story about a lone truth seeker challenging the corrupt establishment? The problem is that reality is rarely this simple. Mainstream archaeology isn't a monolithic establishment conspiring to suppress truth. It's thousands of individual researchers, many working in difficult conditions with limited funding, excavating sites, analyzing artifacts, publishing findings, and engaging in constant debate and revision as new evidence emerges. The discipline has changed dramatically over the past few decades, incorporating new technologies, new methodologies, new theoretical frameworks. It's not a rigid orthodoxy, it's a dynamic field constantly evolving. But it's also true that disciplines can become conservative, that established ideas can be hard to overturn, that researchers can sometimes be too quick to dismiss challenges to accepted views. The history of science is full of examples where the mainstream was wrong and the outsider was right. The challenge is that it's also full of far more examples where the mainstream was right and the outsider was wrong. Being a maverick doesn't make you correct, but being part of the mainstream doesn't automatically make you correct either. Truth doesn't care about institutional status or popular acclaim. It only cares about evidence. And that brings us back to the central question. Is the evidence strong enough to support Hancock's theory of a lost Ice Age civilization destroyed by cosmic catastrophe? After examining all the arguments, all the sites, all the claims and counterclaims, what should we conclude? Let's explore these final questions as we draw this journey to a close, and consider what Graham Hancock's quest for Atlantis means for our understanding of who we are and where we came from. As we reach the end of our journey through Graham Hancock's theories about Atlantis and lost civilizations, it's time to step back and consider what it all means. Not just whether Hancock is right or wrong, though that question certainly matters, but what his work tells us about human curiosity, about our relationship with the past, and about how we construct and contest narratives about where we came from. Let's start with the most straightforward question. Based on the evidence available, is Graham Hancock's theory about an advanced Ice Age civilization destroyed by cosmic catastrophe correct? The honest answer is that the evidence remains inconclusive. Hancock has assembled an intriguing collection of anomalies and mysteries, from the undeniable sophistication of Göbekli Tepe to the widespread flood myths, from the precision of ancient monuments to the geological evidence of the Younger Dryas climate event. But intriguing anomalies and mysteries aren't the same as proof of a specific explanation. The fundamental problem with Hancock's theory is the absence of direct, unambiguous evidence for the civilization he proposes. If an advanced culture flourished for thousands of years during the Ice Age, we should find more than just ambiguous structures and mythological hints. We should find artifact assemblages, distinctive styles of tools and art, burial practices, remains of settlements, even if those settlements are now underwater. Advanced cultures leave garbage, broken tools, discarded pottery, building foundations, all the detritus of daily life. Where is that material evidence for Hancock's proposed civilization? Hancock's answer, that most of the evidence is underwater or was destroyed by the catastrophe, is possible, but ultimately unfalsifiable. You can't prove a negative. You can't definitively demonstrate that something didn't exist. But in science, the burden of proof lies with the person making the positive claim. Hancock is claiming that a civilization existed. It's not enough to point to mysteries and anomalies and say these might be explained by a lost civilization. He needs to present direct evidence that the civilization actually existed. That said, Hancock has succeeded in asking important questions and highlighting genuine puzzles in the archaeological and geological record. Göbekli Tepe really does challenge conventional narratives about the development of civilization. The Younger Dryas really was a dramatic and poorly understood climate event. Ancient peoples really did achieve remarkable feats of engineering and astronomical observation. Flood myths really are surprisingly widespread across cultures. These facts deserve investigation and explanation, even if Hancock's specific explanation isn't accepted by mainstream scholars. Moreover, Hancock's work has reached and inspired millions of people around the world. His books have sold in vast numbers. His television shows and Netflix series have been watched by audiences far larger than any academic documentary. His appearances on popular podcasts have introduced his ideas to millions more. Love him or hate him, agree with him or not, Graham Hancock has shaped how a generation thinks about ancient history and lost civilizations. What explains this appeal? Part of it is certainly the quality of Hancock's storytelling. He writes engagingly, speaks compellingly, and constructs narratives that are both intellectually stimulating and emotionally resonant. His work taps into deep human yearnings, the desire for mystery and wonder, the sense that there's more to history than the official accounts tell us, the hope that we might rediscover lost knowledge or wisdom from the past. But there's something deeper at work as well. Hancock's theories resonate with people who feel alienated from or skeptical of institutional authority. In an age when many feel that they can't trust governments, corporations, media, or academic institutions, the idea of a lone researcher challenging the establishment and uncovering hidden truths has obvious appeal. Hancock positions himself as an outsider, free from the constraints and biases that supposedly afflict mainstream academia. And for his audience, this outsider status is a feature, not a bug. It makes him more trustworthy, not less. This dynamic reveals something troubling about our current moment. The rejection of mainstream archaeology that fuels Hancock's popularity is part of a broader rejection of expertise across many domains. Climate scientists, medical researchers, economists all face skepticism and dismissal from portions of the public who believe these experts are either mistaken or deliberately misleading. The conspiracy thinking that sees archaeologists as suppressing evidence of lost civilizations is cousin to conspiracy thinking that sees scientists suppressing evidence about vaccines or climate change. This isn't to say that experts are always right, or that skepticism toward authority is always wrong. Healthy skepticism is essential to a functioning society. Experts do sometimes make mistakes. Established ideas do sometimes need to be overturned. But there's a difference between healthy skepticism and blanket rejection, between questioning specific claims and dismissing entire fields of knowledge, between demanding better evidence and assuming that any amateur with a theory is as credible as someone with years of training and experience. The challenge for mainstream archaeology is to engage with public skepticism without either capitulating to unfounded claims or dismissing legitimate questions. The response to ancient apocalypse from many archaeologists has been commendable in this regard. Rather than simply attacking Hancock, many have used the opportunity to explain their own work, to share the evidence for established chronologies, to demonstrate how archaeological knowledge is built up through careful excavation and analysis. They've made themselves more accessible and more visible, using social media and other platforms to bring archaeology directly to interested audiences. This kind of engagement is crucial because the debate over Hancock's work isn't really about Göbekli Tepe or the Younger Dryas or underwater ruins. It's about how we know what we know. It's about the difference between evidence and speculation. It's about the value of expertise and specialized knowledge. It's about how science works, through gradual accumulation of evidence, through replication and verification, through peer review and critical examination, through the slow, often frustrating process of building reliable knowledge about the world. Hancock represents a different way of knowing, one based on personal investigation, intuition, pattern matching, and a willingness to see connections that experts dismiss. This approach can sometimes lead to insights that more cautious scholars miss, but it can also lead to errors, to seeing patterns where none exist, to confirming biases rather than testing them. The question isn't whether Hancock's approach has value. Any approach to knowledge-seeking has some value. The question is whether it's reliable enough to overturn well-established scientific findings. And the answer in most cases appears to be no. But here's what's valuable about Hancock's work, even if his specific theory about a lost Ice Age civilization proves incorrect. He's reminded us that human history is longer and more complex than we sometimes acknowledge, that there's still much to discover and understand about the ancient world, that the conventional narrative, while based on solid evidence, is nevertheless incomplete and subject to revision as new discoveries are made. He's inspired people to take an interest in archaeology and ancient history, even if that interest sometimes leads them to conclusions that professional archaeologists reject. And perhaps most importantly, Hancock has highlighted the genuine mystery and wonder of the human past. Our ancestors achieved remarkable things. They built monuments that still stand thousands of years later. They developed sophisticated knowledge of the natural world. They created art and stories that still move us. They survived ice ages and climate catastrophes. They spread across the entire planet, adapting to countless different environments. Their story is extraordinary even without invoking lost civilizations or cosmic catastrophes. Professional archaeologists understand this. They've dedicated their lives to uncovering and understanding the past. But sometimes, in the technical language of academic papers and the cautious hedging of scientific discourse, that sense of wonder gets lost. Hancock, whatever his errors or excesses, never loses the wonder. He approaches ancient sites with genuine awe. He communicates that awe to his audience. He makes people care about the past, makes them curious, makes them want to understand. And if that curiosity sometimes leads people to question his conclusions, to look more critically at the evidence he presents, to engage more deeply with mainstream archaeological research, then he's done a service, even if it's not the service he intended. Where does this leave the question of Atlantis? Plato's sunken city remains what it's always been, a powerful story that captures something deep in the human imagination. Whether it was ever a real place, whether some memory of a real catastrophe lies behind the myth, these questions may never be fully answered. The ocean keeps its secrets, time erases evidence, and sometimes mystery is more powerful than certainty. The search for Atlantis, whether conducted by professional archaeologists or alternative researchers like Hancock, is ultimately a search for ourselves, a search for origins, for meaning, for connection to a past that feels simultaneously lost and recoverable. Graham Hancock has spent over 30 years on this search. He's traveled the world, dove in oceans, climbed mountains, explored ruins. He's written millions of words and reached millions of people. He's been celebrated and denounced, embraced and rejected, and through it all, he's never stopped asking questions, never stopped searching for evidence, never stopped believing that there's more to the human story than conventional history tells us. Whether he's found the answer or simply asked better questions, that determination and curiosity have value. They remind us that the past isn't dead and buried. It lives in the monuments our ancestors left behind, in the stories they told, in the knowledge they preserved. And it lives in us, in our endless fascination with where we came from and how we became who we are. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you'll dream of that lost civilization, of cities beneath the waves and knowledge forgotten. Perhaps you'll see the comet fragments falling, the tsunamis rising, the survivors fleeing. Perhaps you'll feel the weight of all those lost generations, all those forgotten lives. Or perhaps you'll dream instead of the real human story, the story archaeologists are painstakingly uncovering, of hunter-gatherers becoming farmers, of small villages growing into cities, of humanity slowly, haltingly, magnificently building the world we inherited. Both stories have truth in them. Both speak to who we are. The sun rises on new discoveries every day. Archaeologists are excavating sites, analyzing artifacts, uncovering secrets that have lain hidden for millennia. Perhaps tomorrow they'll find something that vindicates Hancock's theories. Perhaps they'll find something that definitively disproves them. Or perhaps, most likely, they'll find something that complicates the picture further, that challenges both mainstream and alternative narratives, that reminds us that the past is always more complex than we imagine. That's the beauty of archaeology, the joy of investigation, the thrill of discovery. We're still learning, still questioning, still searching. And whether you believe in Graham Hancock's lost civilization or you trust mainstream archaeology's patient accumulation of evidence, whether you think Atlantis was real or purely mythological, we can all agree on this. The past matters. Understanding where we came from helps us understand where we're going. And the search for truth, even when it leads down controversial paths and sparks heated debates, is worthwhile. So keep questioning, keep searching, keep wondering, but also keep thinking critically. Keep demanding evidence. Keep distinguishing between what's proven and what's possible. Because the truth about our past, whatever it turns out to be, deserves both our passion and our rigor, both our imagination and our skepticism, both our wonder and our critical judgment. Graham Hancock has given us a vision of a lost world, a civilization destroyed by cosmic fire and rising floods. Whether that world ever truly existed, the vision has power. It reminds us of our vulnerability, of how fragile even the greatest achievements can be when confronted with natural catastrophe. It reminds us that we don't know everything about the past, that mysteries remain, that the story isn't finished. And it reminds us that human beings have always been more capable, more creative, more resilient than we might imagine. So thank you for joining me on this journey through Graham Hancock's theories about Atlantis. Thank you for keeping an open mind while also thinking critically. Thank you for being curious about the past and willing to explore ideas that challenge conventional wisdom. The search for lost civilizations continues. New evidence emerges, new debates erupt, and somewhere, beneath the waves or buried in unexcavated sites, the truth waits to be discovered. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of archaeology's most controversial theories, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. There's so much more to explore, from ancient mysteries to forgotten civilizations, from the earliest humans to the great empires that shaped our world. The past is vast and strange and endlessly fascinating, and together we'll continue uncovering its secrets, one story at a time. Sleep well and dream of lost worlds. Good night.